Hey everybody. I think Kanzi's just had some technical issue, so we might just kick off with this session. And in the meantime, she will probably come back. We can, until then, obviously, I can just let you know that we will have the session at the end for 1 hour of networking before, of course, Robert comes on to speak. And be sure to check out the arena and the other things that we have going on. But for now, while Kanzi gets back on, I might just kick things off from my end. So as you know, this is the first session of day 2, and we've got an incredible guest with us here. Robert DONAGHUE, of course, is the new CEO of Squash Australia, and it's great because Robert hasn't been around squash for very long in this capacity. He has a background in sports, and he's been involved in various different sports such as water polo and others. And without further ado, I think we'll get straight into it. Let's have Robert take the stage, and I will disappear from here once again, and then Kanzi will come back and continue on after Robert to take questions. Robert, welcome to the stage.
Thanks, Ushan. Appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to everyone. I think 6 weeks in now, so slowly but surely getting my head around all things squash. But really excited to be involved in the sport, and I think this is a great opportunity for the sport across the world to share ideas and understand the challenges and opportunities that we've got ahead of us. And I think if anything, COVID over the last 12 months has given sport and I guess the world more broadly an opportunity to think about or reset and reframe how they go about their business. So I don't think we're any different than that. And certainly from a Squash Australia point of view, we're in a rebuild and a reinvigoration stage of the sport, and we're sort of really excited about what the next number of months as I sort of get my feet under the desk and get around and talk to as many people as I can in Australia about the game and where these are, and then in place to take the sport. So if you just wanted to flick to the first slide, just to give you a bit of a background from. I've been involved now in sport for well over 15 years. I worked in HR for about 10 years prior to that, but and I played rugby union was my sport, and I played that here in Australia at a domestic level, and then also had the opportunity to do that over in the UK, in England and Scotland towards the back end of my career. And one of the great things about that sport is the opportunity to meet people and play right across the world, and I think squash certainly has got that opportunity for players as well. So I sort of started my sports administration career with Scottish Rugby as a development officer, working with kids in schools, teaching them about the game of rugby and introducing them to the sport, and then came back home to Queensland and worked for Queensland Rugby for almost 10 years. And they are the governing body for the sport in Queensland, one of the states here in Australia, and also has a professional team, the Queensland Reds, that plays in the Super Rugby competition. And so I sort of worked there for 10 years in a range of different roles, and finishing as the GM of operations that had responsibility for the community game, the operations of the facility, the stadium that we trained out of and had played out of previously, and also then putting on the game day experience for Super Rugby here in Brisbane. Also had the opportunity to work with World Rugby around the HSBC World Sevens series. So it came to the Gold Coast for a number of years. And when you're talking about sports looking at new ways of introducing participants into the game, Sevens is a really great example of how rugby embraced a new type of sport. The traditional 15-a-side game had started to decline here in Australia, and the introduction of Sevens introduced a whole new range of people into the game, and in particular women. And ultimately, the Australian team won a gold medal at Rio, and that has done enormous things for the game here in Australia, and particularly the women's game here in Australia. And so, all sports, I think, are looking at ways in which that they can think about their sports differently. And certainly that was a success story, although it had its challenges at the start. It certainly was a success story, and being involved in the Olympic Games was a huge opportunity. And then ultimately winning the gold gave us a huge legacy to drive that back here in Australia. I then moved to an Olympic sport, Water Polo Queensland, as the CEO there for a number of years, and worked with the national body around a range of different events. So we had the FINA World Water Polo League here on the Gold Coast for men, so hosting that competition. And then we went through a process of working with government here and Tourism Board in Queensland in consolidating the national championships for water polo into one single event that came to Brisbane in January each year. And the economic impact of that ended up being equivalent to some of the bigger sports here, bringing a major event to the stadium here. So it gave government an opportunity to think differently about how they fund sport, and not necessarily concentrating on the top end of the game, but 3,500 people plus their associated families all coming into one location for a 2-week period has a reasonably strong economic impact. And so water polo was able to leverage some new commercial income into the game that it didn't previously have access to on the basis of making that decision. And it was a game-changing decision for the sport. And then I spent the last 18 months just prior to COVID working with the Brisbane Bullets in the NBL, and that was a really interesting experience because the NBL down here in Australia is owned by a private operator. So most of the major sports here are run on the traditional federated system, but this is run by an individual, Larry Kesselman, who bought the league when it fell over a number of years ago. And he has essentially invested his own money into bringing that league back and then ultimately having a professional league here in Australia. And it's widely accepted now that it's probably within the top 2 or 3 leagues in the world now. And the NBA, a lot of NBA players now are actually investing in owning those teams. So it was an interesting model to work in and understand, I guess, the world of private ownership. And private ownership of leagues and the lessons you can learn out of there, and some of the agility they were able to have because they had that private ownership model and weren't necessarily constrained by the traditional federated structures that sport tend to be here in Australia. And excuse me, and then that brings me to this role here. I did some consultancy work through COVID in sport and with a sport tech company. But the next part of my career, I really wanted to work in a national sporting organisation, a national body, and lead that through a cycle. And really excited by the opportunity to do that with squash here in Australia. So next slide, if I could, please. So we're coming, or the board essentially has worked with our members, and particularly the states, over the last number of months to start to set the direction for where we want to take the sport over the next period of time. And towards the back end of this year, we're hoping to have completed the strategic planning process for the next period. What that period is will be borne out in that process. But right now, we've got 4 pillars and 4 working teams that are working across the areas of participation, performance, profile, and facilities. And I don't think we've invented penicillin there, and most sports here in Australia are working across those pillars. But we obviously want to have more people playing the game more often. We want to make sure that from a performance point of view, we have high-performing players, we have high-performing teams, organisations, and all the systems and the pathways that continue to ensure success at major competitions. Profile, I think everyone's talked about this. Zena obviously talked about it in that session just previous to here about the profile of the sport. So how do we increase the visibility of squash, and how do we increase or make it a better experience when coming and watching and playing squash? and obviously facilities, and no doubt this is not unique to Australia, but the facilities we have here were built back when the game was at its peak, and not a lot of investment has gone into the majority of our facilities here, or they have closed because they haven't been seen as commercial enough for those private operators to keep them, whether they be within health centres or gyms, or whether they be private squash centres themselves. So, a big part of our strategy is understanding how do we find new places to play, more places to play, and modern places to play. So, particularly if we're trying to attract the youth into the game, walking into a squash centre, whether that be in a gym or in a health centre, or whether that be in a standalone centre itself, is an attractive place to come into. So I'll just quickly sort of touch on those 4 pillars and some of the challenges or opportunities we've got in there. Next slide, if I could, please. Participation. This is a stark slide, and I've deliberately done that because there's no shying away from the fact that the sport here in Australia, at its peak, is said to have had around about 1 million people playing the game in a year, and it was a game that was synonymous with life here in Australia. And if you talk to people in my generation and older, we were kids of the baby boomers who played the game, and there hasn't been a conversation I've had in the 6 weeks I've been here where someone hasn't said to me, "Oh, my mum and dad played squash," or "I remember squash back in the day when I used to play it." So the great thing about that is that we have a history of the sport here in Australia. We're not trying to introduce a sport to people here that they're not aware of or haven't played before, or hasn't been a success here in the country before. It's had its challenges since that period of time, but it's finding the ways in which how we can ultimately bring back that interest in the sport that it once enjoyed here in the country. And we've probably got a circa 200k of people who have played the sport in some capacity across the country in any one year, whether that be in your weekly pennant competitions, whether that be a social game with a friend at a health centre, or whether that be school programs or junior programs that might be being run in clubs or centres. So it is our biggest challenge, and without people playing the game, clearly then everything else around that, and particularly around our performance and pathway, makes it very difficult for us to continue to perform at that level if we haven't got the volume of people playing the game for us to be able to find that talent. Next slide, please. There's a range of reasons why squash has declined over the years, but one of the biggest challenges we've got here in Australia, and no doubt this is similar in a lot of countries around the world, is the rise of physical activity over sport, and the move away from the traditional club-based participation in sport to a more individualised physical activity participation in sport, and that has been, I guess, the biggest challenge that most sports here in Australia have grappled with, is how do we turn our sport, particularly if it's been a club-based sport or a team-based sport, how do we attract those people who aren't necessarily looking for that type of consuming the sport, and how do we reinvigorate or reinvent ourselves, or how do we find a new version of our game to attract those people to want to come and play a version of our sport. Next slide, please. So Sport Australia actually went through a process and identified through this Future of Australian Sport report of these 6 mega trends that essentially talk about how people are consuming sport here in this country. So a perfect fit up the top there, that's all about the rise of individual sport and the move towards fitness-based activity away from traditional club-based models, and the challenges around, I guess, particularly sport and organised sport, attracting those people. Mainstream to extreme, so this is the rise of lifestyle sports or extreme sports or extreme physical activity sports, your CrossFits, those sort of things. That's also resulted even at an Olympic level where they've looked at those and introduced some of those sports, BMX, rock climbing, breakdancing even, which has broken our hearts, obviously, around Paris, but a shift towards the extreme sports. The more than sports are, using sport as a vehicle for, healthy lifestyle, addressing obesity, addressing some, physical and mental health. How does sport help address some of those societal issues? It's everybody's game. So we've got an aging population here. We've also got a very strong multicultural population here. So how does sport address that? New wealth and talent. This talks about, I guess, the right, and many sports have tried to take advantage of that. In rugby, they took the World Cup there. It was a great success. In Super Rugby, they introduced the Sunwolves in Japan, which was not necessarily a success. And even football here in Australia moved from the Oceania Federation to the Asian Confederation, and obviously and all of the benefits that came with being in that federation. So the rise of Asia and our role in that, or our part of that, being Australia, and then the tracksuits to business, which is about, I guess, the market pressures. So at a very simple level, the cost of participating in sport. Some sports, it's becoming more and more expensive every year to play the sport, but also the money available in sport at the highest level that allows athletes to be able to compete at a professional level, and also the impact that has on attracting talent into your sport. So, in a market here where we have 5 professional sports that we're competing with for that talent, a lot of the time we miss out on the best athletes. Because they will go to a rugby or a rugby league or a cricket or a basketball or a football, one of those professional sports where they can make a living as part of that. So, that whole economic impact has a real impact on us from a talent point of view and a retention point of view in terms of how do we get the best talent playing our sport and ultimately performing for us in those major competitions. Next slide, if you could, please. And then obviously, COVID has had a huge impact on sport across the world, and it's been interesting. Sport Australia is now starting to do some research on the impacts of that, and some of the initial impacts that they're identifying. The motivations for physical activity or sport while we're in variations of lockdown here in Australia, and some states had longer and some shorter, but more broadly across the country where there has been restrictions on sport and physical activity. The motivations for people to get out and get involved in sport. Heavy emphasis on that physical health and fitness, and also helping them with the psychological mental health therapy. So being outdoors instead of being caught inside. And also some social connection as well. So obviously with isolation has meant that we weren't able to spend time with family and friends or club mates or within that social scene we would normally have been around. So physical activity has helped facilitate those social connections during COVID. Next slide, please. This one is probably of no surprise, but when you see it, you understand the impact that COVID has had on our sport. And over on the right hand side there, 97.2% of people who participate in squash did not participate during COVID, and the vast majority of the reason for that is because those centres were shut down, and for people, and there were heavy consequences for doing so. So that's obviously had an impact, or knock-on impact then on centres and the commercial viability of those. And the biggest challenge we've got now is making sure that we can get all of those people who were participating prior to COVID back again, and active in squash, whether that be in the way they used to previously or in some other way. But it's a huge challenge for us. And then when you look on the other side there about the activities that people have been participating in through COVID, your jogging, your running, your yogas, your exercise at home, bike riding, all of those individual fitness-based sports or activities have been the thing that people have turned to and could very well have fallen in love with during that period of time. And our challenge will be moving people back towards our sport or finding a way for our sport to I guess, attract those people because of some of the elements that we've got in our sport that they also do have through those physical activities. So where I think, and Zena mentioned this just briefly at the back end of her presentation, where I think there's some opportunities for us as a sport. We've obviously got that real strong fitness element to the game. You get a great workout in the 45 minutes or an hour that you're in playing a game. It's a short and sharp game. So for those who are time poor, who are just looking for a short activity to get their physical activity, you can do that. You can play with a friend, you can play with your partner, male or female. You can play with a colleague. You don't have to wait for the whole club to be there, or for a training night or on a Tuesday and Thursday to go down and get your physical activity. You can play that with friends, partners, colleagues. You can play it. It's played across many cultures. So there's 20 million people that play squash throughout the world, across different countries, and as they come and live here in Australia, there's a huge opportunity for us to integrate them into our communities through sport, and using squash as a way of doing that. I think is really important, and also gives them an opportunity to play the sport that they love in their new country. It's cost effective still. Any age, any ability can play it. We've got an aging population here, and that aging population played squash back in the 70s and 80s, so it's still a sport that they can play. And we've got a really strong masters scene here still in Australia on the back of probably that period of time back in the 70s, 80s and 90s. And it can be played anywhere, and I put this in italics because I think there's a real opportunity for us to think differently about what is squash. Yes, there's squash that's in the traditional court, on the traditional floor, with the traditional formats of the game, but even, there was talk yesterday about concrete courts, or, even if a kid is hitting a ball against a wall with a racket and there's a line of tape on the wall, that they identify that as squash and not tennis. So then that starts them falling in love with the game from an early age, and it's not reliant upon them going down or finding a squash centre or playing the traditional version of the game. It's a hybrid version of the game, but they're learning the core skills or getting involved in that game, and it's just a matter of switching that from every kid here in Australia at some point in time hits a ball against the wall with a racket, whether that be a tennis racket or a squash racket. So how do we get them to identify that as squash, and then have programs in place that ultimately transition them into to playing the game in its truest form? Thank you. Next slide. From a performance point of view, we've had great success as a nation in squash for a long period of time. 33 medals we've won at Com Games since its inception, and 47 world championships since 1976. And some of the names and families that are synonymous with squash came from Australia. But what our challenge is at the moment is that we are now undertaking, I guess, a generational transition in both our men's and women's programs. So our top players are at the back ends of their careers, or they've stayed playing to help us, in this transition. And we've got a real of making sure that we've got the next generation of talent in programs working with us to ultimately have success on that international stage, and also the opportunity to become professionals and play that on the PSA Tour. We've got a real opportunity with our National Training Centre, which was a legacy item out of the Com Games here on the Gold Coast. So we've got 6 courts on the Gold Coast now that our national program operates out of. So there's an opportunity for us, obviously, to have a centralised program, but also for athletes to be able to come at points in time throughout the year and access our national coaches and our national programs. And we've just introduced a Performance Pathways Network with the support of the Australian Institute of Sport and Sport Australia here, where we've got performance pathway coaches now working within each of the states, albeit they're only 1 day a week at the moment. We hope to be able to grow that over time, and the commercial part of the business will help facilitate that. But those roles will be critical for us, working with those athletes in their home states, in their home programs, as they develop, to ultimately then be able to take the next step onto the international stage and give us that continuity of performance, and us not find ourselves in a situation in another 10 or 15 years' time where we've had a good core group of people come through and be successful for us, but there's nothing coming in behind. And so that's our real focus from a performance point of view at the moment. Next slide, please. Profile and commercialization. I won't read through all of this, but I think partnerships, digital and major events is where we're going to get a lot of opportunity for here. So, understanding what the assets we have here in Australia from a commercial point of view, to build some volume, and be able to have conversations with companies, not just companies that are involved in squash, but companies that want to achieve things through sport, and how they can partner with us to achieve that. The PSA's obviously done this with In Front, and I've talked to Alex about this. How do we consolidate our digital assets and take control of the digital content here in Australia, and package that up, so that ultimately we can show that, people can watch it, it becomes something that people can see. Broadcasters here in Australia now have moved from the traditional TV models, where it was nearly impossible to get on TV, to they're looking for content to fill their channels, and there's opportunities for us, if we've got the right content, to be able to put that into the mainstream TV networks here, or the mainstream online streaming networks here now, and there being a visibility of our product at the top level, because it's awfully difficult for a kid to aspire to playing squash at the Commonwealth Games or on the professional tour if they can't see it, or they've got to go looking for it. And so how do we make that more available for them? And then and that goes hand in hand with major events. So obviously we had the Com Games here in 2018, and that was great. But how, like I said in water polo, how do we understand the economic impact of our events here in the country, and how do we package them up to make that more attractive, and we can attract investment in it? Identifying iconic locations. I think everyone tells me, and I've seen them myself. Obviously, the pictures of the glass court in front of the pyramids. Every country has got those iconic locations, and if you're able to do that with your events, then I think that lifts your profile. And Australia has obviously got some real iconic locations that are recognisable around the world. We obviously have to reimagine that event day experience, and for us, the Australian Open, it needs to become one of the premier events in the world that the PSA Tour and the players on that want to come and play and win each year. And we have to have an aspiration to build that over time. That won't happen in a short period of time, but I think if we've got that aspiration, then that ultimately gives us the opportunity to then have an event here where we can leverage enormous opportunity from, and we can have kids being able to go and watch the best level of squash here in Australia and aspire to be one of those players one day. Next slide, please. Facilities. I saw this image. I think it was on LinkedIn, and I think this says everything to me about what a squash facility should look like. It's modern. Architecturally, it works. I can think of locations here in Brisbane where this would be fantastic, but most of all, it is visible, and that's our biggest challenge here. And obviously, around the world, is most of our squash centres are hidden within private courts or health clubs, or they're just in buildings that aren't well signed or are dated. So, how do we work with government? How do we work with local councils? How do we work with private operators to modernise our facilities, but also have these facilities which blend in nicely with the modern day architecture and landscapes in which we operate. We've just kicked off our facilities working team here, so that's a big focus for us over the next number of months, is to start to identify what are the things that we need to be thinking about in that space, and engaging with court owners and operators around how we help them make their businesses commercially viable, but also how we help them modernise them and make them a place where people want to be. Next slide, please. And then, last but not least, there's a huge opportunity for us as a sport more broadly, and Zena touched on the Olympic bid and the opportunities around that, but the work the sport needs to do to get to that point. But I think for us here in Australia, a home Olympic Games in 2032 has completely changed the narrative about how sport is going to be funded here in this country, and I think that. 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was discussions about, does sport need, particularly on the back of COVID, does sport need to continue to receive the level of funding it does? But this announcement that potentially Brisbane has those games in 2032 has completely changed the narrative around funding in sport, and ultimately that will benefit us as a national body here, whether we play in the Olympics or not. If government invests more into sport, and obviously the Commonwealth Games is our opportunity at the moment, but if government is investing more in sport, then that gives us an opportunity to continue to grow and continue to perform. But ultimately, and as Zena said, Australia is synonymous with squash, and how great would it be for squash to be introduced in the Olympics in 2032 in Brisbane? We'd be really excited by that opportunity, and obviously we'll work closely with all the federations around the world to put our best foot forward for that opportunity, whether that be in LA or in Brisbane. So I think that was me.
Thank you so much, Robert. We really appreciate your time and for going into all those details. It was very insightful. So we have time for one question before our next speaker goes on. So this is a question from Paul Selby. Shout out to Paul, who was again my first sponsor growing up, head. So Paul is saying, is there enough desire to build new facilities across Australia to cope with the growth and participation, especially as squash in Australia has lost so many facilities over the last 20 years?
I think there is a desire to build more sporting facilities more broadly, and squash needs to get ourselves in the conversation with government, particularly around multi-sport facilities, as a sport that wants to be involved in those discussions, and how we can connect into those with the other sports that may be building those. Sport government here in Australia doesn't invest very often anymore in single-use facilities. They're very much focused on multi-sport and multi-use facilities, and how men and women can use those facilities. So I think there's an opportunity for us to get into the conversation with government around, if you're building multi-use facilities, how do we become part of that discussion and influence those local councils or those clubs that are building those to be part of any development. But it will be a challenge, no doubt.
Thank you so much, Robert. So just so you know, you will only be able to exit the session after the whole session ends. I just wanted to ask you if you will be available to go to the lounge after the session so that people can ask you their questions, because we have so many questions for you. Yeah? Okay, amazing. So for all the attendees, after the session ends, feel free to go to the lounge and find Robert, and then you can ask him all of your questions. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you.
Next, we have a short video by Ranked In, who is our diamond sponsor for the Squash Summit. So please, let's watch the video. Thank you so much, Rangden, for this quick and short video. So for everyone attending, just make sure you head to the booths where you can find the Rangden table. You can talk to the founders and the co-founders to ask them any questions you want. We also have a booth for each sponsor, so make sure you check them out. Next, we have a few words from Adriana Olaya, who is the manager of the PSA Foundation. But before she comes on, we're going to play a quick video from the PSA, and then she will come on to talk about We Are One fundraiser that has been initiated by the PSA Foundation.
On the court,
We are rivals.
But off the court,
we are one.
كلنا واحد.
Kita jaga kita.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Sushan, Kanzi, thank you so much for this. I wanted to thank all of you for your support and your donations to the PSA Foundation, to our We Are One fund. We have raised a total of £1,879 so far. So thank you very much. This help really goes directly to our players to keep them playing and come back stronger on the tour. So if you want to find out more about what the PSA Foundation does, please visit our website, and I'm also going to post a link here to donate so we can reach our target. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the summit.
Thank you so much, Adriana, for your words. Be sure to visit Sportage's booth for some exciting information about their new projects and upcoming work, which also the co-founder for Con will be sharing more info about at the end of the conference. Now, without any further ado, I want to introduce you guys to our next speaker, who is MAXIM P. WEITHERS. He is a mind coach. So MAXIM is a former Colombian national junior coach and the founder of Mental Trainer Certification. He's also the mental coach of our famous player, Miguel Rodriguez, who is also the British Open champion in 2018. MAXIM will be discussing neuroscience-based squash and finding new global audiences for squash marketing. MAXIM, are you ready? Perfect.
Hello, guys. Okay, just wanted to get my slide up. First of all, I'd like to edify all the people involved in the Sportages team and Kanzi, Sushan and Farkan for putting together such an amazing event. This is something that obviously we really needed, and it's going to be important down the road as to how we develop squash on multiple levels. So thank you very much for everyone also who came on board and woke up early, got everything organized to be present with us today, and so we can get started. Farkan, can you blow that up, or can I try to share my screen, please? Yeah, let me try and share my screen there. Okay, can you guys see that okay? Can someone let me know? I can't see the screen, but
We still can't see the screen that you're sharing.
you can see it or not?
No, we can't.
You cannot.
Hey Maxim, yeah, sorry, that's the maximum I can go with the PDF that I received. So would you be able to, I can probably zoom in further, but it would hide parts of the slides. If that's okay, I can just move it up and down for you.
Sure, let's see what
Sure.
yeah, it's not allowing me to share for some reason. Okay. Yeah, so my topic today obviously is going to be around neuromarketing for squash. We're going to talk a little bit about the science of squash. I think someone mentioned yesterday, Alan, I think, mentioned yesterday about how it is a science these days and how marketing is going to play an important part of squash moving forward. Next slide, please. So yeah, so a lot of the stuff that I do is transformational, not just from sports athletes, but also for businesses. And the way I started, back in 2010, I moved from Canada down to Cartagena, Colombia, and opened a travel business, mostly rentals, property rentals. And I had no idea what kind of clients that I would attract. So, as most of you guys know, like first thing that you do when you want to learn something is get a coach. So if you're going to take a driving course, you want to get a driving coach. If you want to learn, get a university degree in something, you go to school and you learn that. And of course, if you want to play squash, you get a squash coach. So I got a business coach. And my coach is by the name of John Ashraf. He was in The Secret. You'll see a few photos of him later on. He's built several multi-million-dollar companies and 2 multi-billion-dollar companies. He's probably done about $8 billion in sales from all of his programs. Next slide, please. So we're going to discuss today a little bit in neuromarketing, how the brain actually works, what's driving decisions. A lot of businesses, I think every business out there needs this because we know what to do, but how do we do it? You know, what's driving the decision of our potential clients? We're going to look into the mindset, the skill set, what kind of tools we need, and what kind of actions. And when I say actions, I'm talking about mainly habits. And then we're going to talk a little bit about CRMs, customer relation management systems. So any kind of really sound business that's successful is basically running on a system. So it's a protocol, there's specific steps in place, and this sort of thing is required. Any of the big businesses that are out there that have been successful for many years, they're using a system. So it's predictable step-by-step actions, and it's a predictable income results for the business. And then we're going to look a little bit about into the future of squash. You know, what's squash going to look like in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years even. That's going to be very exciting. So let's move to the next slide. So what I'd like everyone to sort of imagine is that you know, we don't know what we don't know, basically, and that's everybody basically is in that category. There's always something that we don't know. There's always something that someone has worked on and spent more time learning about and focusing on. My passion, of course, is brain science, neuroscience. how the mind works. I think it's fascinating. We really don't know that much about the mind and what drives all of the things, but we have gotten very, very close to figuring out a lot of things. A lot of people know what to do, but they don't know how to do it or when to do it. They're very specific steps to making things happen. Next slide, please. So this is the kind of mindset we really have to think about. Right? Progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. Right? George Bernard Shaw is an author from the, I think, 1800s, 1900, early 1900s. But that's what we have to start thinking about, changing our mindset to change our results. Next slide. This is actually a video of how the mind works and what's driving some of the forces. You can jump on my Facebook page. I think this is a PDF, so we don't have the video for you, but it's about a 1-minute video, and basically it looks at how one part of the mind is moving at about 40 bits of information per second, whereas the really powerful part of the mind is moving at about 500,000 times faster than that. And so we need to learn how to tap into that energy. We have much more potential than most people understand and believe. And I think when we tap into that little device that we have between our ears, then we can really move things along at a much more efficient and successful rate. Next. So this is Seth Godin. He's one of my mentors. He's a marketing genius, and he says people do not buy goods and services; they buy relationships, stories, and magic. So we're going to talk a little bit about this. Some of the big companies that are out there, they've got great stories. They're in contact with their audience. They know who their audience is. They know how to reach them. And then the magic, which is, this topic that I'm talking about is very, very difficult to discuss online. The next image, if you can pull that up, I'm going to attempt to explain and give you an experience that can help you realize what your potential is and how your conscious and subconscious mind really can be super important and super fun. Next slide. Okay, this should work regardless of where you are. There you can see an image of a girl and there's 3 dots on her nose, right? What I'd like you to do is maybe expand your screen so you've got a full screen, right? And if you can look at these 3 dots for about 30 seconds, just focus on the 3 dots. And when I say stop, I want you to close your eyes and look up to the ceiling. Not yet, but just keep focusing on the 3 dots for a few seconds. Okay, if everyone can close their eyes and look up to the ceiling. Okay, can you zoom back out, Zushan? Okay, now if you saw what I saw, basically, and you can describe what you saw on the chat box, but basically what you saw was, and anyone let me know if they saw the girl in color or black and white, and if you could still see the image, but in different in a different perspective, right? Now, what happened there is you basically tapped into 2 parts of your mind. Okay, one was when we're looking at the image, we're only using our conscious mind to see the image, but we don't actually see with our minds. We with our eyes, we see with our eyes, with our brain, our minds, and so our subconscious mind is actually translating all of that information that our conscious mind is looking at, and then that's how we're able to tap into the subconscious when we close our eyes and look up. Next screen, please. So imagine you're a flea on this elephant, right? The elephant's moving this way, and wherever that movement is, that's where the mind goes. 95% of all of our actions are subconscious, as you just witnessed, as you just experienced, right? That's really what's happening most of the day. So what drives that are the subconscious behaviors that we grow up with, learning from a very young age, up to age 7 to 10. The human mind really hasn't developed too much of a conscious mind. We're still in that alpha, beta. The beta mindset comes a little bit later. But we get a lot of information and a lot of behavior patterns that it's taught to us by obviously our parents, family, teachers, grandparents, anyone that's around us who are adults. We pick up on all of those behaviors subconsciously. And it's interesting to find out these things with business owners, CEOs of companies, and also players, athletes that don't know why we know we're doing something wrong, but we don't know how to change it or why we're doing it, and we don't know, therefore, how we can reverse that and get the results that we want. So I love this image because it's a real important one to understand how the brain is working all the time. Okay, next slide, please. So there's a book by an author called Simon Sinek. It's called Start with the Why. And it's important for you as a business, for example, clubs and organizations, players, to decide and figure out what is your why, what is your purpose, what is your story, why do you want to do what you want to do, why does squash want to become an Olympic sport, why do squash players want to get back on court and be a vibrant part of their life. All these things are important. We have to ask that important question. The biggest companies in the world, they talk about the why first, why they do it, their vision. That's the important thing. And then they talk about the hows and the whats and what they're doing. It's called the Golden Circle. You can look that up. Simon Sinek is the name of the author. The other thing is obviously your story. My story, I grew up playing squash in the Bahamas with my uncle who's English, and then moved to Canada, learned a lot of squash from the Canadian squash federations and organizations, and then turned pro straight out of high school, basically. Won the Canadian Junior Championships and got a 5-year contract to train with Ramit and Jahangir over in London. So, your story is very important, and what you tell yourself, the inner story, basically your inner voice, you have to make sure that you surround yourself with the people that are going to take you to that next level. Basically, one of the quotes that I like to use is, you're the sum of the 5 or 6 people that you spend the most time with. So whether you're a business or whether you are a player, it's important to surround yourself with a team. The squash has 4 or 5 different components. Of course, if you go to a squash coach, we're going to learn the technical stuff, strategies probably. We need a fitness coach. We need a physiotherapist. And of course, now we know more than ever that the mental game, the mind game, is very crucial. Up to 90%, 80% of the game is crucial. We don't lose matches because of fitness. We don't lose matches because of our technique or strategy. Almost everyone has all of those really good skills down pat, but the mind is where we can lose it, and that's what we have to train more of. Next slide, please. So, of course, this is the famous picture of Ramit Roshan, which is Jahangir's father, and Jahangir on the far right. This is his story, right? This is what drove him. There hasn't been really a compelling story about squash play for a very long time. And of course, if you don't know, Jahangir's brother, who took him under his wing and brought him to London to train, died very suddenly at a very young age. And this is the Jahangir, his father, and Ramat, who's a cousin of Jahangir, at Torsam's grave, and obviously making a decision at that time to compel him. That was his passion, was to succeed in this goal, which was to win the World Championships within 2 years. I think at this age, at this time, he was 15, and obviously we know the outcome of that 2 years later in Toronto, Canada. I was actually able to see that match in Toronto. He beat Jeff Hunt in 4 games. Next slide. So what we do today, right, is your future. We don't basically have anything right now that we didn't think about and took action on 2 days ago or a week ago. We are basically a different person every day that we are alive. And whatever we think about in the past, that's what has created our present, right? So we have to start thinking about all the things we're going to think about, how we're going to think about them, what kind of actions and habits we're going to create, so that we can have that predictable future. Next. So these are my 10 steps for a better squash world. We're not going to get into all of them, but I can tell you this, that I have a system that has been used by my mentor, John Asraf, who's built those 5 or 6 multi-billion-dollar companies, multi-million-dollar companies, and the 2 multi-billion-dollar companies. And I can give you all of that information. And you'll see a slide of it coming up very shortly. But the key will be how to implement those steps so that this stuff works, right? So we have the mindset, we talked about emotions, triggering emotions, story. Facebook and a lot of the social media companies, they know how this works. They know how to trigger people. It's a very addictive set of social media programs out there, and they know how the mental programs work in the general population. So we're also going to talk a little bit about the skill set, the CRM, sales, marketing, customer service manuals. I think we need this for squash. There's been a lot of debate in some of my groups, the Global Marketing for Squash, on whether we work from the top down, which when I say that is the professional level down to the grassroots, or whether we do it the other way, and what the coaches basically in the general population, what do they know? What's missing from that environment? And we came up with several different steps, a manual, a service manual, customer service manual. These are skills that we have to learn as squash coaches and squash pros to grab the attention of those out there, and also maintain the ones that we have, and then grow the fan base exponentially. So we have to, number 4, we have develop good habits, eliminate bad habits. One of the things that we found also was that all of these things are all brain oriented, and we can have the best information, but if our brain isn't refueling properly, our brain is an organ, and our brain does use actually a lot of energy. Approximately 20% of our mental faculty is being used by our brain, and the subconscious mind uses quite a lot, and then the prefrontal cortex, which is the newest part of the brain, which I'll get into in a second, actually uses about 40 to 50% of that energy. So one of the things that we realized is maintaining good quality food, food absorption, food elimination, assimilation, and quality of sleep, right? Gratitude is another thing. A lot of my students, they talk about getting nervous before matches and so forth. Gratitude is actually one of the things that you can use to eliminate that hormone that called cortisol, which floods the brain, gets into the body. The interesting thing is that when you are in the state of gratitude, that actually blocks out and stops the cortisol from being released. I like to show this. These are my gratitude journals. The last one here is just being filled in, but every night I try to put in at least 3 to 5 different things that I'm grateful for. And that really helps on many levels. I find when I do that, I get better results in my life, health, and so forth. And we can talk a little bit more about that. Anyone wants to join me in the chat room. Journals, lists, visualization boards, and success formulas. Beliefs plus action minus distractions. That's one of the things that we have to look at. Next slide.
Maxime, so sorry to interfere. I just wanted to let you know that we are kind of running out of time, so I just wanted to make sure that you have time to go through your most important slides. We have about 5 to 7 minutes left.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. Next slide. So this is actually from my business coach. There you have it. It's a step-by-step system. It's worked for multi-billion-dollar companies. Communication, neuromarketing, creating trust and rapport. All the different steps that you would need to build a business. It's right there. How do you do that? That's the trick. Some of the things that we talked about is the Olympic bids have been going on for about 32 years now. What are we missing? What's the thing that's been missing from these steps? I think a lot of it has to do with figuring out how to form your pitch properly. A lot of it is body language. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Can you move to the next slide, please? Right, and if we don't do that within the next 6 to 12 months, we're just going to keep in a downward spiral, right? We can get better. There is a way. There's methodologies that are out there that's working, and we just have to implement those. Next slide. So these are the 2 parts of the brain. The red part basically is the subconscious, or the initial part. The brain is was created on 3 different levels. The subconscious was the first. Basically, the next slide, please. So we have a primal brain, which is what we call the reptilian brain, and then the rational brain, which was formed most recently. Our brain is basically about 100 to 200,000 years old, the current brain that we have. But of course, man has been around for millions of years, and this is how we've developed. Problem is that the world has actually changed faster than our brains has been able to adapt. Next slide. So there you can see the different levels of the brain. The 2 basic parts on the bottom, the limbic brain, actually that's the emotional brain, and then we have the logical brain that was just formed, and that's how we became the more dominant animal on the planet. The reptilian brain is the flight and fight response, and that's mainly the part of the brain that helps us to survive. That's how the brain still functions, and that's how we have to work when we're trying to attract new audiences. It's basically from the inside out, and most people try to do it the other way around. So that's where we're getting a disconnect. Next slide. Okay, next slide. We'll talk about that later. So, for example, if I said something like, don't think about a pink elephant, right? In order to not think about a pink elephant, you have to think about a pink elephant. So, again, training the mind consciously to subconsciously get into those 95% of actions that we need to really get the ball rolling. Next slide. Yeah, we can talk a little bit more about this in the lounges, but we have 4 different patterns of thinking, and this is how it works, from unconscious to conscious, and then habitually doing things at the right time, the right way. This also happens on the court, right? Next slide. Right. This is more for marketing, but this is a decision process that the brain goes through. We know about it, and we know how to implement it now. And these are the things that we need to implement when we're putting together programs for clubs and organizations. Next slide. Meditation is another thing that we use to relax the brain. Big companies do this. For example, Oprah Winfrey, her organization does a 20-minute meditation before the day starts and a 20-minute meditation at the end of the day. It does amazing things for creativity, for fluidity of the business day, and it puts everyone in a good state of mind. So very important. Next slide. So what are we talking about here? Next slide. Communication, right? 55% of our communication is still by body language. The problem is today we're on things like Meet and all of these different online programs that where you can only see the face. Now that picture of the baby, there's something called microfacial expressions. We need to learn how to do that on impulse, so we can tap into different microfacial expressions. How we smile, whether somebody's telling the truth, if they're genuine, whether they're thinking about you or they're seriously focused on what you're saying and so forth. It's all body language still, 55%. Tonality is the next key communicator. And then spoken words, the things that I'm saying, you're not going to remember only about 7% of that, right? Next slide.
So sorry, Maxim. This would have to be your last slide, so I'll just let you take this one, and then we can wrap up the session.
Okay. So this is a slide on communication. These are all the generations to date that we have. We know about the baby boomers, X generation, Generation X, Y, the Z, Gen Z, and then the newest population is the Alpha generation, right? So we have to know how to communicate with our audience. That's the first thing, right? If we don't know who we're communicating to, we can't know how to communicate with them. Today, it's a totally different message. It's a totally different approach than we had, say, even 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And I think this is something that all the organizations, businesses, and even squash bros need to tap into. So, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maxim. So for those who want to chat to Maxim, you can speak to him at the end. Maxim, will you be in the lounge?
Yeah, I'm on table 36. If anybody wants to sit in.
Perfect. And then you can also share the slides with Sportageous if possible, and then they can share it with the attendees.
Perfect.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Kenzie.
Of course. So we're going to just jump into our next session right away. Unfortunately, we won't have time for our break. We had scheduled a 10 to 15 minute break now, but unfortunately, due to the time, we're just going to jump right ahead in session 2. So see you all in